Hello everyone, welcome to the Teaching English webinar for teacher educators, in which Mark Almond will look at how to develop and support teacher motivation, resilience, and professional identity. My name is Shirin Soyaz and I'll be your moderator today. Thank you all so much for joining this live event. Before we start our session, I'd like to share a number of quick housekeeping reminders with you. While waiting, please share with us in the Q&A where you are from. If you work in pre-service teacher education, type pre-service. If you work in in-service, type in-service in the Q&A. So this session is being recorded and a recording of the webinar will be available on Teaching English in the next couple of days. The link to the certificate will be provided in the thank you email that you'll receive tomorrow. And finally, you'll have a chance to ask questions during the session. Please use the Q&A to ask our presenter your questions. Let me introduce you to our guest today. Mark Almond is a senior lecturer in the Center for Language and Linguistics at Canterbury Christ Church University, UK. He has worked as a teacher, trainer, and consultant in Europe, Asia, and South America. His main interests of areas are the use of drama and theater in language teaching and performance-related skills for effective and affective teaching, to maximize social psychological harmony and success in the classroom. He has published 2 books, Teaching English with Drama and Putting the Human Center Stage, Practical Theater Techniques to Develop Teacher Presence, Rapport, and Positive Classroom Community. Mark, over to you to launch today's session.
Right, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, everybody. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen, and then I think we can get going. Right, okay, so hello everybody. It's really a pleasure for me to be here, and I would like to begin by thanking the British Council for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak to, I guess, quite a large number of teachers from around the world. It's a great opportunity for me as a teacher educator to actually work with a number of teacher trainers from different educational settings around the world. So thank you very much, British Council, for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity. So as you can see on my opening slide, the main focus of this talk will be on, it's threefold really. We're going to look at identity, motivation, and resilience. And we're going to think about how these aspects of teacher education can be incorporated into continuing professional development programs. Now, I know one of the questions that Shirin asked you at the beginning was how many of you train pre-service teachers, beginner teachers, novice teachers, and how many of you train in-service experienced teachers? So I would imagine, I mean, I haven't had a look at the responses to that question, but I would imagine that there would be quite a variety amongst you working with pre and or in-service teachers. But obviously, when we work with pre-service teachers, we must remember that we are not working with a blank slate, i.e. all of the teacher trainees we work with, whether they are pre-service or have a number of years experience, they've all been through an education system. They've all had life experiences of one kind or another. They've all been on the receiving end of education, and they have particular teachers that have exerted either a positive or negative influence on them. All of these things come together to make up really who we are. And who we are, of course, is the first issue that we're going to deal with, i.e. teacher identity. And I imagine, all of us, we're teachers and teacher trainers. Being a teacher is probably a very, very significant part of who we are. And I would imagine that for many of us, we found ourselves in social settings with friends or family, and they've said, oh, you know, I can tell you're a teacher. And they say this for a reason. It could be, for example, the way we want to organize groups, make decisions for groups, you know, in certain social settings and that kind of thing. So being a teacher is probably a big part of who we are, and we often exude that part of our identity. And that reminds me actually of a very short anecdote that a colleague once said to me. She said she was out with her young daughter one day, and her young daughter, she was about 6 or 7 years old. She was cycling down the path, and the daughter fell off her bike and started crying, and her mother rushed over to her, and the poor daughter looked up with tears streaming down her eyes and said, "Please don't ask me what I've learned from that experience." So even in settings like that, you know, we can't help but sort of slip into that kind of teachery role. So our identity is a very, very important part, a very important consideration within our professions. So let me move on to my next slide. So this is an overview of the areas that I'm going to cover: the what, the why, and the how. First of all, we need to define our terms. So I'm going to briefly cover what we mean by teacher identity. I've kind of just alluded to certain aspects of our identity already. So identity, and then we're going to look at a definition of motivation. And by motivation, in summary, I kind of mean, you know, what drives us to become teachers in the first place. I remember talking to a friend of mine who works in the state system in the UK, and he's been teaching for over 20 years. I said to him one day, you know, what made you want to become a teacher in the first place? And he said there were 3 reasons. 3 reasons are Easter, summer, and Christmas. I think he was joking. I hope he was joking. But of course, we all go into the profession for different reasons. And I think when we work with teacher trainees, whether they're new teachers or experienced teachers, I think establishing and clarifying why we're in it in the first place is really important. So that's motivation. And then the last strand of the talk will be about resilience. What keeps us going, which is incredibly important, of course. And then the next part of the talk will be looking at the why, whether we consider teaching a vocation or vacation. So I've kind of just covered that with the previous bullet point. And then the final point will be a more practical aspect and how we can work with our teacher trainees to maintain their motivation and resilience for their physical and mental health and well-being. Because as we'll see later on in the talk, the attrition rate, certainly in the UK, the attrition rate is worryingly high. In other words, more and more teachers are leaving the profession for various reasons. But a significant reason is because of the damage that is being done to their physical and mental health and well-being. So obviously we'll go into a little bit more detail later on. So this is the map for the talk. So let's carry on. Let's see what we've got. Okay, so let's begin then by looking at what we mean by teacher identity. So this idea of teachers behaving like teachers, I gave you some examples at the beginning of the talk with the mother and her daughter. When we think about identity, it's obviously a very, very complex area when we try and pin down exactly what makes us who we are. But obviously, for our purposes and in our contexts, we're just thinking about what our identity is within the classroom. And if we borrow from aspects of social psychology, then we can break it down. We can think about our identity in terms of personal identity And by personal identity, that would include things like sexual orientation, our gender, our age, our ethnicity, religion, social class, nationality, culture, our beliefs. And by beliefs, I mean, you know, what do we believe that education is for? What's the purpose of education? So all of these things, and there are many others as well, that go up to make our personal identity. The other aspect is our collective identity. So as a teacher trainer and as a teacher, what do you feel part of? For example, do you feel part of an international group of English language teachers? Do you feel part of a group of each student you teach? Do you feel a part of your school community? I won't go through the list because the list is quite exhaustive, but this is what we mean by a collective identity. So personal identity and collective identity. And all of these things are co-constructed and co-authored because our identities, our personas, are constructed largely on the basis of the many interactions that we engage in on a day-to-day basis. And this is why I use the term crucible. Okay, so when we think about teacher identity, as part of the research I carried out when I put the booklet together for the British Council on this topic, I asked teachers to think about how they think they are perceived by their students, or if they were teacher trainers, how they think they are perceived by their trainees. And some of the words that were used, I asked them to sort of list 4 or 5 adjectives that they think their students would use to describe them. And they came out with things like maternal, approachable, easygoing, enthusiastic, humorous, trustworthy, honest, assertive, professional. Lots of very, very positive adjectives, which of course is very healthy. A separate piece of research that I carried out, which was for the second book that Shirin mentioned at the beginning, Putting the Human Centre Stage, I carried out research into teachers and teacher trainers, past teachers, and how they have influenced them. And I call this the ghosts of teachers past, because I think this is relevant in this talk, because there's no doubt that, you know, as I said at the beginning, we've all been through an education system. We've all experienced what we consider good and bad teachers. And it's inevitable that to a greater or lesser extent, we are influenced by them. And some of the adjectives used in that research when teachers and teacher trainers talked about their previous teachers, they used words like kindness, patience, respect, openness, sense of humour, demanding and challenging, and the list goes on. But they also listed some negative attitudes as well, such as cold, aloof, distant, unfair, sarcastic, and they even mentioned things like the way they were dressed. So sloppily dressed was one adjective used, and dowdy. Other respondents also mentioned the quality of their teacher's voice. And they said that their teacher's voice was loud or sharp or aggressive or gruff. And so what this demonstrated to me is that however many years ago that we were at school and we had these experiences with these particular teachers, these memories still live on. And I'm sure if I ask you all now, you know, think of a memorable teacher that you had, whether good or bad. Probably if you closed your eyes, you could visualize them quite easily. You could quite probably even hear their voice in your head. And you could recall particular lessons that these teachers delivered, and generally the kind of teacher that they were. So our identity and how we come across to our students is incredibly important. So when we're working with teacher trainees, I think, right at the very beginning, I think it's really important to raise their awareness of how they think they come across to their students and the kind of identity that they construct when they're inside the classroom and interacting with students. Now, the other aspects of this talk, so motivation and resilience, the basic premise really of this talk is that I believe we can maintain motivation and we can maintain resilience through the positive interactions that we have inside the classroom and with the rapport that we build with our students and the conducive learning environment that we can create. Because of course, as teachers and teacher trainers, there are lots of external factors that restrict us. There are lots of factors which are beyond our control. And so it's my strong belief that if we're in the profession for the enthusiasm, the passion and the love for our subject and for the desire to improve the life chances of our students, then the best place to start is inside the classroom and focusing on the interactions that we have with our students. Okay, so these are some of the results from the research that I carried out for the booklet for the British Council. And one of the questions you can see is your persona in the classroom different from that outside of the classroom? And you can see that 86 out of 162 replied yes, and 76 replied no. Interestingly, the word persona comes from Greek and it means mask, literally. And so the suggestion there, not just us as teachers inside a classroom, but really in our everyday lives with all the interactions that we engage in, there's always an element of mask switching. And it obviously depends on the context, who we're speaking to, and why we're having this exchange with another person or other people. In other words, what our aims are of a particular interaction that we have. So there's always going to be an element of mask switching. And I'm sure you as experienced teachers and trainers, you can think about when you're inside the classroom, obviously depending on who you teach, then there are going to be elements of your persona or your identity that you slip in and out of. And these are things that we can't really prepare for. These are things that often have to be improvised. And because of that, I think a lot of trainers think that here we're talking about things which are untrainable. A lot of people believe that these are things that we can only learn through experience. Now, there's no doubt that we can learn an awful lot from reflection and experience, no doubt about that. But obviously, from my standpoint, what I'm arguing for is that these aspects of teaching should be embedded in all teacher training programs. Because I think, as I'm going to cover a little bit later on, methodology and the technical aspects of teaching are often covered exhaustively on teacher training programs at every level. But very little emphasis seems to be put on these other skills that I'm referring to here in the context of this talk. And obviously what I'm arguing for is that yes, we can certainly learn a lot from experience, but there are also elements and things that we can cover inside the training situation that we find ourselves in. Okay, so let's move on. I hope all is clear so far. Okay, so teacher identity. So as I just mentioned, on teacher training programs, I'm sure you all cover the technical skills of teaching and knowledge about language and second language acquisition and different methodologies and approaches. These, of course, what are vital, and they're what I consider to be the nuts and bolts of teacher training and continuing professional development programs. But how much of our time do we spend with our trainees on reflecting on classroom climate and how they create a conducive classroom climate, how they develop their interpersonal skills with students, and how they develop their rapport with students? Now, if we refer back to the previous research on the previous slides and think about how many of those comments relate to a teacher's technical skills and knowledge, and how many relate to these human aspects of teaching, you'll remember that the vast majority, in fact, if not all of them, refer to the latter point there. They refer to classroom climate, interpersonal skills, and rapport. And I'm sure if I ask you all, think of a memorable teacher and tell me about him or her, then the likelihood is you will start saying, oh, yeah, he was a very strict teacher, but he was always very fair. I remember his voice, it was very calm and deep. And there are these human aspects that we all tend to remember. So they obviously, live long in our memories and are incredibly important. So what I'm saying is, there should be more of a balance between these two areas that you can see on the current slide. Okay, let's move on. So, motivation. Now, on the slide, these are the results from the respondents to the British Council survey that make up the booklet that I wrote. And these were the key factors for maintaining enthusiasm and satisfaction in their teaching careers. So I'll just give you a second to read those. I'm just going to have a little bit of water, excuse me. Okay, so you can see the vast majority of respondents to the survey refer to the value that they place on working with young people, helping young people, the vocational aspects of teaching, the human aspects of teaching, improving young people's life chances, having a healthy rapport. All of these things are really important. And 76 respondents said, the love of their subject. So English, the love of English was a strong motivational factor. And as the quote at the bottom of the slide says, a teacher's and her or his students' emotional states and motivation are inextricably codependent and will positively or negatively affect each other. And I think we'd be hard pushed to find somebody who disagreed with that, to be honest. So yeah, so I suppose in a nutshell, what I'm saying is, if a teacher walks inside the classroom and is passionate and enthusiastic and is pleased to see their students, takes a personal interest in their students and is curious about their students and demonstrates that he or she wants to help their students, this is obviously going to have a positive effect and affect on their students' motivation and their enjoyment of their learning. So let's think about, though, the kind of the negative aspects. So right at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that the attrition rate in the UK in the state sector is very, very high. So I'll just give you a second to read through those quotes. These are all headlines in UK newspapers in the last year. So they mention burnout, they mention physical and mental health issues, the terrible effect that the pandemic has had on education, even things like teachers experiencing misogyny in school at 70%. The headline at the bottom refers to body cams, and a body cam, if you don't know, is a body camera. Very similar to the kind of body cameras that the police wear. And there are certain schools in the UK where teachers have actually started wearing body cameras because discipline and violence within schools has got to such a terrible level. And of course, and you know, the other headlines report on the high attrition rate, i.e. teachers leaving the profession. So these are reasons, you know, why teachers become disenfranchised in the profession. They become demotivated to such an extent that they leave the profession. And on this slide, these images relate to some of the responses that I got from the British Council survey. So one of the questions in the survey was, what are the key factors for you for limiting your enthusiasm and satisfaction in your role as a teacher? Kind of self-explanatory, really, so, but I'll just very briefly run through them. So the fact that very often teachers are under enormous pressure to put students through exams, and sometimes their careers or their jobs depend on good exam results. And so as a result of that, we experience what's called negative backwash, i.e. teachers spend an inordinately long time in class preparing students for exams. And that takes obviously a lot of enjoyment out of students' learning. And there's a slide there that refers obviously to the COVID pandemic, and where teachers had to wear face masks in the classroom, and one of the previous headlines on the previous slide mentioned this, about how it's negatively affected students' social skills. There's an enormous amount of paperwork that and administrative duties that teachers have to do these days. Teachers complain that they are underpaid, that they work very, very long hours. In fact, just last week, I was talking to, I bumped into a friend in town, and he's been teaching for 2 years in a local secondary school. And I said, we were actually in the supermarket, but obviously I knew that I was about to give this talk for the British Council. So I thought I'd just pick his brains. And I said, so just very quickly, just typically describe a typical day for you. And he said, well, he gets to school at about 7:30 in the morning. He gets ready for his day's lessons and does any administrative work that he has to do. And he teaches for the whole day, and he probably leaves school at about 5:30, 6 o'clock. And then he goes home, and most evenings has 2 hours work to do at home. That is an enormous amount of pressure that teachers are under. And so it's not surprising that teachers feel burnout. So yeah, but that was a good live, current example that I can give you. And I'm sure that a lot of us and a lot of our trainees feel the same. And then just the slide on the bottom left, which is taken from a very popular British cartoon, a comic called The Beano. And of course, discipline, maintaining discipline is a big issue for a lot of teachers. So I don't want to dwell too much on the negatives, but of course we need to be aware of these. Our trainees need to be aware of these. If we are training novice teachers, they need to be aware of these, and they need to start thinking about how they can put into place strategies for dealing with it. So to sum up really about motivation, I'm sure we're all familiar with the concepts of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and they're often used in the context of our students' motivation. Well, when we think about us as teachers or the teachers that we're working with, then for them to maintain motivation and to keep going and to keep fresh and to keep enthusiastic and passionate about their jobs, then we hope to engender an intrinsic motivation within them, or they do it within themselves, i.e. they can recognize, acknowledge the internal rewards that teaching brings them. They can recognize the purpose and meaning and what education means for them. Why are they in the job in the first place? And if they can identify these sort of vocational elements to teaching, then they naturally lead on to being passionate and energized and enthusiastic in their jobs. And so that is what makes teachers, or good teachers, effective teachers, motivated. And of course, as a result of all of that, the teachers are motivated, and if teachers are motivated, and this comes across in their teaching, then there's a much greater chance that their students will be motivated as well, because their students will feel that the teacher cares about them and is interested in them and wants them to flourish. Okay, and then I'm going to pause just in a moment after this slide to give you a bit of a chance to take a breather. I need to take a breather as well, because we've covered quite a lot of ground. So I'm just going to cover this slide briefly, and then I'll give you a chance to ask any questions that you may have. So when we think about resilience and what that means, a working definition of resilience is how we adjust, respond, and learn from stress that we experience, the pressure that we're under, any disappointment that we might experience, and any disproportionate challenge that we come across in our lives. So how can teachers we work with raise their resilience levels? And this is something we'll discuss in a moment. But as I said, I'll give you a couple of minutes to just reflect on what I've been talking about so far and give you the opportunity to ask any questions you may have, and I'll try and answer them. So Shirin, do you take over from this point?
Yes, so first of all, thank you so much, Mark. Before we move on to the questions, some of our participants are saying they can't hear you clearly. Would it be possible to increase your volume a little bit so we can also please dear participants, you can also increase the volume on your computer or device. But just in case you can't hear it clearly, we'll share the recording with you tomorrow on Teaching English website, so you can also see the recording and the slides tomorrow. So one question from Ali Ahmed is about the term that you used at the beginning of the session, the ghost of teachers past. At the start of the session, you used this term. Can you please recap on the influence of previous teachers?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, for me, it personally, it's really important, because when I think back to my secondary education, I can, and I'm getting on a bit, but I can still visualize, remember, recall teachers' voices and the way they taught me now, and the memory's still very fresh. So what I was referring to then is the influence that the previous teachers have on the way we teach. And I think, I was talking about this in the context of identity. Now, one thing I talk about in the British Council booklet is that when we're working with trainees, we don't want them to mimic previous teachers they've had. I mean, certainly what's inevitable is there will be elements of previous teachers' identities that we kind of subsume when we become teachers. And I think that's inevitable. So that's essentially what I meant by, you know, teachers, the ghosts of teachers past. In other words, elements of previous teachers, aspects of their teaching, the way they taught us, the way they were inside the classroom, and how we've consciously or subconsciously subsumed some of those attributes in our own teaching. But I think, though, what is really important is that we don't mimic. I think when we work with trainees, you know, we need to say to them, you know, find your own true, authentic teacher self. Because especially, you know, if you're working in the secondary sector, where we're working with teenagers and teenagers around the world, because I've worked with teachers all around the world, and I speak to teachers all the time from different teaching contexts. Teenagers all around the world are basically the same. There are certain elements of being a teenager that are pretty much identical. And teenagers are certainly pretty expert at detecting any sort of lack of authenticity or genuineness.
Yeah.
So did I answer that clearly? And I hope you heard me. My sound's not very clear, but
yeah, definitely. We should be reflecting, right, on our teaching, and yes, definitely.
yeah, but also, sorry, just to follow up, but just really quickly as well, though, I think I included that that piece of research into this talk, because when teachers reflect on their teachers, they also talk about these human aspects, these human attributes of teachers and how important they are. So I think that, you know, further emphasizes the importance of these human skills that are so essential in our teaching to help us maintain our motivation and resilience. Yeah.
And when you say resilience, especially during the pandemic, with the sudden onset of the COVID pandemic, teachers across the globe felt the need to respond overnight to some challenges and facing. Ayesha asks the questions about this. So facing the mental, physical, and health issues due to job. The COVID has become a global problem for teachers. So would you like to tell us about the impact of the pandemic on these three themes on teachers' mental, physical, and health issues, very briefly?
Well, to begin with, you know, I mean, I can just refer you back to one of the headlines on a previous slide, which stated how young people's social skills have been quite significantly damaged because of the pandemic, you know, because of social distancing and because of teachers and students having to wear masks in class. There was a study carried out in the UK on primary age children, and the results quite alarmingly stated that young children of primary school age were now becoming less able to read other people's facial expressions and non-verbal behaviors. So that's one really negative impact that the pandemic has had. And I think, you know, just speaking from a personal point of view, you know, I do most of my teaching at a university in the UK, but just speaking personally, I think, you know, speaking to colleagues and friends, I think we're all still suffering. You know, it's and I think we're all still a bit shell-shocked from it. We're all still readjusting to being back at work, to being back in the classroom. And yeah, I mean, it has been a great challenge for everybody. And you know, hopefully, you know, the next half of my talk is hopefully going to give you some practical ideas about how we can help our trainees overcome these difficulties that we're facing, because you know these difficulties exist anyway. You know, teachers have always had these pressures put upon them, and some of them are within their control, and some of them are not within their control. But you know, with the pandemic that we've just all been through, that obviously adds another significant dimension to the pressures that we're experiencing. So hopefully the next part of the talk will be useful, because it will offer some practical suggestions about how we can help our trainees.
Yeah, absolutely. Very important. We mostly focused on the cognitive aspects during the pandemic, but as you say, the affective risks are sometimes, I mean, more important. They have more risks, the human factor as well. So let's continue. Then we look forward to hearing the practical tips from you.
Right, lovely. Thank you very much, Sharon. Thank you. And thank you for your questions as well. Okay, right. So we've gone over a definition of what we understand by resilience. So how can teachers we work with raise their resilience levels? There's a whole list, I think, that I included in the handbook for the British Council, but they include things like the importance of teachers having a healthy self-esteem. And I think going on one of the questions from the research about how teachers think they are perceived by their students, and that long list of lovely positive adjectives, I think that was quite gratifying to read, that yeah, most of the respondents already have quite a healthy self-esteem. But also things like having a healthy sense of humour. That means it certainly doesn't mean standing up in front of your class telling jokes, but what it does mean is not always taking yourself too seriously as a teacher, showing your students your human side, being in the moment. I mean, for me, the biggest part of using humour in my teaching is the times when I have to improvise. Something happens in the lesson, it's I couldn't have predicted it. It was completely unexpected, and just something I might just make a comment, I don't know, something simple like I might make a spelling mistake on the whiteboard, and a student points out that I made a spelling mistake, and I might say, oh yeah, it's the pen's fault, and I blame the pen for making the spelling mistake. Just little things like that, you know, just comments that are off the cuff, and really important for creating a relaxed, egalitarian kind of environment inside the classroom. And again, it's all about teachers showing their human side. But other things that teachers can do to maintain their resilience levels, think about how good their general communication skills are, not just with students, but also with their colleagues, and with line managers, and even with parents. It could include things like how we regulate our stress levels and how we manage our time. Really, really important. You know, so there might be, you know, a day when the paperwork piles up, you've got 30 pieces of homework to mark, you've got 5 lessons to teach, and you just think, right, you know, this is getting a little bit on top of me. How am I going to cope with this? And being able to manage that stress level is incredibly important, and to try and avoid that feeling of being overwhelmed. And we all feel it. I feel it sometimes, and I just need to breathe. I need to make a list. I'm a very avid list maker, and so if I've got a list of things that I need to do, I'll write them down, and then each time I do them, I very gratifyingly tick them off and say, done that, and then I move on to the next thing. So these little psychological things that we can do to help us manage our stress levels. But these things also include things like how sociable we are and how much we enjoy relationships at school and outside school. Whether we socialize with colleagues from work, or whether we have generally a healthy social life is really, really important. And also very, very importantly is whether we can maintain our work-life balance. And I'm going to look at some practical ideas about how we can raise our trainees' awareness of their work-life balance in a moment. So I won't talk any more about that now. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Oops, my screen is frozen. Oh, there we go. Right, there we go. Okay, so when we're working with our trainees, one thing we need to start by doing is getting them to think about their lives right at the point that we're training them. So we need to raise their awareness of how good their work/life balance is. And so this is something we can do. So what I've done is I've broken down a life, if you like, into these different elements. And what you do is you ask your trainees to circle their level of satisfaction for each domain. Right, so I'll just give you a second to look over that, but it's very straightforward. So, if you're really, really completely satisfied with your teaching, then you give yourself a 10 or a 9. If you think that your professional development as a teacher is suffering, is not as good as it could be, then you might give it a 1 or 2 or whatever. Okay, and then basically at the end of it, you've got a visual representation of these different domains of your life, and you can see whether there is balance or whether there is imbalance. And these are the questions that we need to ask our trainees. Now, those of you who work with novice teachers, so i.e. teachers who've got little or no experience at all, then these questions still apply. Now, obviously, they can't relate these questions to their own teaching experience because they haven't got any yet. But what we're doing is we're raising their awareness. And so we're saying to them, well, okay, you've not got any teaching experience yet, but these are really important for you to flourish in your future job. So bear these things in mind. Okay, so hope all of that is clear. So obviously there's no silver bullet. There's, I certainly can't offer you a panacea for these constraints and these pressures that we all experience, because each individual person watching this webinar is going to have different experiences. But what I'm hoping you will do is try and relate what I'm talking to you about today as closely as possible to your own teaching context. So, this is a list of questions. And each answer will obviously be different for each individual teacher. So let's move on to the next practical thing that we can get our trainees to do. So certainly, when we think back to a previous slide about the pressures that teachers face on a day-to-day basis, the restrictions we have, and the reasons for demotivation. Very often they're due to what we call a low decision latitude. So I'll just give you 10 or so seconds to read that slide so you get an idea of what I'm talking about here. Okay, so essentially what I'm referring to here is the different aspects of our jobs that we either have complete control over, some control over, or no control whatsoever over. And these things can impact on our enjoyment, our motivation, and our resilience in our jobs. So some of these things, I know, some lucky teachers, they're teaching in certain contexts, and they are able to decide the content of what they teach completely by themselves. So in other words, they're completely autonomous. But I know, I've got friends and colleagues who work in different institutions, and it's imposed from above. So they don't have any choice at all in what they teach, and sometimes even how they teach it. So these are all examples of pressures that we experience, or if we're lucky, pressures that we don't experience. So with this concept of decision latitude, I think what I try and do is closely relate this to the amount of challenge that we as teachers have, in a positive sense. So the idea is that if we experience high challenge in our jobs and a high decision latitude, i.e. we make most of the decisions in our jobs that affect us, then teachers tend to be more satisfied in their jobs. They tend to maintain their motivation. They tend to enjoy their jobs more and avoid burnout. So obviously, as you go down the scale, if, for example, you discover that your job has high challenge, so in other words, your job is challenging in a good way, but your decision latitude is low, i.e. all of the decisions are made for you by senior management, then that tends to lead to burnout, i.e. teachers become mentally and physically exhausted. If your job has low challenge and high decision latitude, then that tends to lead to the teacher drifting or coasting, not really having any direction in their job. In other words, it's a bit easy for them. It's too easy. And so they just drift. And then right at the bottom, if you have low challenge and low decision latitude, so in other words, if your job is really easy, nothing's challenging, you could do it with your eyes closed and your hands tied behind your back, and also you have no decision-making power, then that tends to lead to boredom in a teacher's job. And of course, if a teacher becomes bored, fed up, demotivated, then that inevitably is going to come across in their teaching. It's very difficult to mask that. So what we're doing is we're just raising our trainees' awareness of these issues and getting them to think in practical terms how they can overcome them. So as I said, with the previous slide, there's no silver bullet, because each one is going to be different for each respondent, for each trainee you teach. So yeah, so I can't, offer a panacea to everyone's problems, obviously. But at least what we're doing is we're raising our trainees' awareness and getting them to think in practical terms of their own specific teaching context. All right, and these are questions we can follow this up with. I'll give you a few seconds to read that. So again, they're questions, not answers, they're questions for discussion. And I think the third question there, which areas would you like more support? That's something that's often neglected. Okay, so hopefully when we're working with our trainees in class, opening the floor up to these discussions with each other, getting our trainees to share experiences with each other, an awful lot of positive and practical solutions can be shared in that way. Okay, so I'm just looking at the time. So I've got a few minutes left. Okay, so thinking about rapport and classroom climate. So again, just continuing on the vein of suggesting some practical things that we can do with our trainees. One thing I love to do, again speaking from experience, when we think about maintaining a rapport and focusing on the human aspect of teaching, working with our students as individuals, this involves quite a lot of work for the teacher, but you can certainly suggest it to your trainees because it's going to certainly appeal to some. And that is, at the beginning of a term, maybe with just one of their classes, suggest that they email the whole class on an individual basis. So not a blanket email, but just an individual email to each individual student. And the first email just says, "Hi, whoever your student is, really looking forward to teaching you this term. I hope you enjoy learning English, and I thought it would be really interesting if we email each other now and again to just share some things with each other and also give you some practice in writing English." Something just very, very general. That was just completely off the top of my head. But just the first email is very, very general, but it's to each individual student. Some students will respond, some won't. Some will think, "Oh, that's a bit odd. Why is my teacher emailing me that?" Okay, so that's fine. So they won't bother, they won't feel inclined to respond. You don't have to put any pressure on them to do so. But some will think, "Oh, that's nice. Okay, I quite like the idea of that. I can practice my English. And I might even find out a little bit about my teacher." And so throughout the term, you continue this email exchange with individual students. So if you've got a class of 30 students or more, that does sound like a lot of work. It is a lot of work, but I'm not suggesting that each time you email your students, you email 2 sides of A4. Just a short paragraph, maybe a little bit about what you did at the weekend. "Oh, I played a bit of badminton," or "I went to a football match," or whatever, or "I watched the World Cup on TV. "Oh, and tell me, what did you do? What sort of sport are you into?" And then the student replies. And these are just very sort of basic, sort of emails that exchange a little bit of personal information, and it's an excellent way of maintaining a rapport with your individual students. So that's a practical thing that you can encourage your trainees to do. Like I said, it is quite a lot of work, but you don't have to respond to emails immediately. You can leave it a few days or just do a couple now and then, and it should only take a couple of minutes to write, to send off one quick email. Another practical idea is to encourage your trainees to observe each other. This is a nice kind of inexpensive way to address continuing professional development. Now, a lot of the time, if you already do these things, then probably a lot of the time will be spent on focusing on the technical aspects of teaching, the nuts and bolts, clarifying language, getting students to practice language, how we get students to develop the 4 skills and all those kinds of things. Well, rather than focus on those, you can design a short observation form, like the one on the screen, that relates only to the interaction that happens between teacher and students inside the classroom. Okay, so for example, you're observing a colleague and you make a note of any display questions that they ask throughout the lesson. Now, a display question, if you're not familiar with that term, is a question that the teacher already knows the answer to. So, for example, you might have the sentence come up in the lesson like, "Last weekend, I went to the cinema." Right? So you're practicing the past simple. And the question the teacher might ask is, do we know when we are talking about? So that's like what we call a concept question. And it's also a display question because the teacher already knows the answer. Yes, we do know when we're talking about last weekend. So that's a display question. A referential question is a question that the teacher doesn't know the answer to. So that might be, for example, you just ask a student, oh, Ahmed, what did you do at the weekend? Anything good? Now, of course, the teacher doesn't know the answer to that question. So that's what we call a referential question. And so it would be interesting to see at the end of the lesson how many of the teacher's questions were displayed and how many were referential. Now, obviously, the more referential questions focus more or give an indication of more of these human aspects of the lesson that have taken place. In other words, the teacher has shown a personal interest in his or her students. Okay, so teacher questions. The observation form might also focus on the amount of praise that was given in the lesson, how much criticism, how the teacher dealt with emergent issues. So as I said earlier, so much of our teaching is improvisation. Lots of things we can't predict for. So how well does the teacher deal with those? How often does the teacher ask for elaboration? So for example, if I say to Ahmed, oh, what did you do last weekend? And he says, oh, I played badminton. So, oh, you know, rather than just saying, oh, that's interesting, ask another question. Oh, so who did you play badminton with? Oh, your sister. Oh, was she older than you or younger? Oh, she's older, etc. Takes a few seconds of class time, but it's obviously they're using their English for a start, which is, of course, what we're in the business of doing. But also you're building a rapport with students. And then the last aspect on that observation form is what I call associating. So in other words, what aspects of the classroom behaviour and language were purely designed for creating a classroom community. Okay, and so as you can see, the observation form asks you to give actual examples from the lesson that you've just observed. Okay, hope all that is clear. I can see that the time is running out. So just to very, very quickly sum up, on our teacher training programs, I believe we need to focus much more on these three aspects of being a teacher. Not what a teacher does, of course, that's really important. The methods, the strategies, the materials we use, of course, absolutely vital. But we also need to balance that with these more human aspects of teaching in order for us to maintain our motivation and resilience. And at the end of it, you know, if we've created these really healthy rapports with our students, it will make us happier. I'm speaking from experience. So we can encourage our trainees to monitor their classroom interactions. Think about all domains of their lives. And if they feel that their job is overwhelming them, they've got too much admin, they've got too much pressure put on them, they have to do something about it. And normally, the only thing you can do, I guess, is talk. Talk to the people who make decisions. You know, if you can't reduce certain aspects of your job yourself because of pressure from above, then you have to talk to people, you know, in a management position. You can't just sit, do nothing, and gradually experience more and more burnout. Right, so that's absolutely vital. And I'll put there on the slide, protect your downtime. One of the previous slides, I had the images of what causes demotivation in teachers, and there was an image of someone on their mobile phone. You know, things like, you know, how often do you check work emails on your mobile phone over the weekend or in the evening? I would imagine most of us do. Try not to, or at least, you know, reduce the amount of times you check work emails on your phone when you're at home, or, you know, the weekend, in the evenings or whatever. What else? The third bullet point, with continual reflection on their teaching, with a particular focus on the learning environment, rapport and behaviour management. And the last point there, communication, not just with students, but with colleagues, managers and parents as well. So we feel much more part of a school community. And I believe, that can greatly increase our chances of maintaining our motivation and resilience. So I think I've gone over time by 5 minutes, so I do apologise for that. But I'll stop there. But just to very quickly say, what I've included here at the end of my presentation are more detailed definitions of teacher identity, motivation, and resilience. So obviously I won't go into these now. I'm just quickly flashing them up on the screen. Because this is going to be posted on the British Council website, so you'll be able to look at them there. But otherwise, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this great presentation. We want to ask one question that summarizes some other questions. I mean, some colleagues ask similar questions. So, whose responsibility is it to enhance teachers' identity, motivation, and resilience? So, how much responsibility does the coordination and administration have to enhance teachers' identity, motivation, and resilience?
Yeah, I mean that's obviously is a really, really key question. And whose responsibility is it? Well, I would say that it's shared responsibility. Now, I'm not sure how many people are watching this live at the moment, but you're all teaching in your different contexts at different levels, and the trainees that you train are likewise going to be teaching in different contexts and different educational settings. So there's not going to be one answer that fits everybody. But earlier I talked about this concept of decision latitude, and I think it is absolutely crucial. I am quite lucky. I work in a British university, and my decision latitude, thankfully, is quite high. It's not very high, but it's quite high, and because it's quite high, I managed to maintain a pretty good balance between work and life. Because I have a relatively high decision latitude, I have responsibility for the way I prioritize things, for example. So I have that certain control over what I do and when. It's not complete, but it's, I can't complain. But for other teachers whose decision latitude is low, in other words, a lot of decisions made about their job is taken by, someone in management, all I can say is open up discussion with management and negotiate, be open, be respectful, but say to them, I love my job, but at the moment I'm just being overwhelmed by the amount of admin I have to do or the amount of teaching I've got to do this term. Is there any way we can kind of negotiate? So it really boils down to communication. And then it's, obviously the schools or the institution's responsibility as well to listen to you and to hopefully respond and perhaps meet you halfway. So that's speaking at a kind of an institutional level about the amount of decision we have ourselves in our jobs compared with the amount of decisions that are taken by senior management. But on a personal level, as I've said, I hope clearly in this talk, is that a lot of these feelings of pressure and dissatisfaction and this feeling of being overwhelmed can be mitigated through more the focus on the classroom climates that we create, the relationships that we develop with our students. That will certainly go some way to mitigating these pressures that all teachers feel.
Very, very.
Is that okay? I hope that answers
Yes.
the question. Bit of a long-winded answer, but it's not an easy thing to answer.
Yes, definitely.
Not a short answer. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Well, yes, we should have, I mean, the bottom-up approach is first of all ideal, but of course also we should, as teacher educators, we should incorporate more opportunities for open discussions with teachers and sharing of solutions for creating these positive classroom climates. And as you say, this more engaging and enjoyable learning experiences, lessons, anxiety and stress for teachers. Hopefully, we hope our participants have found the session useful and picked up some useful and practical guidance. And you can find more tips and guidance in the how-to guide that Mark has produced. So you can see a link to the how-to guide in the chat, and we'll also share it with you. So thank you very much, Mark, once again. We hope to see you again in our future sessions. So, dear colleagues, if you want to find out more about this topic, again, you can download our publication, and we have a new CPD framework and a self-assessment tool for teacher educators. You can find the links in the chat, and the recording of the webinar and the slides will be available on Teaching English in the next couple of days. The link to the certificate will be provided in the thank you email that you'll receive tomorrow. And please share your feedback with us. Don't forget to subscribe to our monthly newsletter for teacher educators. Finally, register for our next webinar, the role of teacher associations in teacher education, on 6th of December. So we very much hope to see you all again in our future sessions. And thank you very much for joining. Until then, have a good day and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Mark.